I'm not going to say much about myself other than to say that pertinent to what I'm talking about here, that I was a practicing artist in the 60s through the 80s, went into graduate school thinking about information policy, kept on working with art-related matters, and in the 80s was writing about digital art, computer art, as it existed in Minneapolis, St. Paul, which was then the Silicon Valley, where the first supercomputers came from. And by the 90s, was heavily involved in the first round of thinking about art in the net. And I thank the IAC for bringing me back to this. I have two new pieces about information economics that are, one's in press, one's already published, and I'll be going further with the kind of work that I'm introducing today. So with that said, I'm just going to share my screen, if I may, and launch. Folks can see it?
Yes.
Okay. So first, what do we mean by the information economy? There have actually been four conceptualizations of the information economy over time. The first, which showed up in the 1960s, was simply saying that the information sector is larger relative to other sectors like industry or agriculture than it had been historically. Otherwise, everything's the same. The second approach was developed by political economists in the 1970s, saying that the economy itself has actually gotten bigger because we have commoditized forms of information and informational relationships that had never before been commoditized. So there's more stuff we can buy and sell. By the 1980s, there was research on saying that the economy itself is operating differently. This is the work where the cluster knowledge-based knowledge production comes from these kinds of, these economists. They're saying that qualitative change in how the economy works, cooperation and coordination as important as competition for long-term economic success. And by the early 21st century, we were thinking of this as an information economy because referentiality has replaced empiricism as inputs into economic decision-making. 2012, they actually gave a Nobel Prize to an economist who figured out that narrative matters. All of these ways of understanding the information economy are simultaneously in play today, in use for various purposes. The US government and other governments still stick with sectors, but companies, canny companies like Meta are going much further. I don't have time today to talk about art from each of these perspectives, but that is in work that is in progress. When we think about art as information in an information economy, it's about the collection, acquisition, or creation of information. It's about its processing, often multiple times. It's about its distribution, and then how we receive and use art as information generates additional information of value. So the functions include primary goods, the retail thing that you buy. Secondary goods are resources that are inputs into production processes that yield primary goods. Services, and by services, we mean things that aren't object-based, but my favorite definition is from The Economist, the excellent news magazine from 1984, defines services as things that can be bought and sold but cannot be dropped on your foot, and processes, the various processes themselves. Each time information is processed in the making of art, there's value. I tell this to my student, actually, each time information is processed, even when you're studying, there's value. All four types of Baudrillardian value are involved. So that begins with what we could think of as natural value, or Baudrillard defines as natural value, where the image is trying to reflect accurately the empirical reality. We then get into commodity value, where the image is actually masking and perverting empirical reality, referring only to the capital equivalent at a particular moment. The structural form of value, the image masks and perverts the absence of reality, referring not to the capital equivalent at a given moment or time, but the structural value of the codes of capital, how it's operating. And then finally, image that has no relationship to reality at all, the fractal or ecstatic value. And I think, in my view, a piece that just got published, I'm talking about information policy as an ecstatic and entropic matter today. Again, I don't have time to work this through fully for art, but that is in work that is to come. So the concept of capital really refers to the capacity to make something happen in future. That can be money, but we have many other forms of capital that we talk about: human capital, social capital, cultural capital. In the information economy, art is involved in many forms of capital. For artists, when we think about financial capital, money, increasingly artists are surviving by selling services rather than their works, their products. And we've gotten into an investment model for artists. We have these interesting interventions in what appear to be finished works that affect their monetary value. So that wonderful bit where Banksy's piece gets shredded in part right after being sold on the auction block. There's a book artist who produced a book that has text that after you read it, the text disappears, those kinds of things. It's very interesting. We have the problem of thinking about what is the work. This is a piece actually from the 90s, but I still think it's a great example for talking about this problem with art in the digital environment. This guy, Jeffrey Schultz, rollerbladed from ATM to ATM machine in Manhattan, using the client's ATM card to withdraw funds. And then the work that the client gets is a map of where he did the rollerblading and the ATM receipts. That was the work of art that the client ultimately held. And then we have the question of who is the artist, and that takes us into NFT land. For society, on the financial capital side, we are seeing innovation at the industry rather than the product level, continuous dependence on technological innovation for artistic affordances. So I remember when Sandy Stone, who's at UT Austin, was needing really high-end graphic processing equipment that wasn't then available to people who weren't in computer science, and what the difficulty of the negotiation to get access to the equipment that she needed. We have digital forms like avatars and related products that level actually global opportunities for popular art. So there are a lot of efforts around the world letting people in Brazilian favelas. I just read a story in all kinds of places, people with no other access to economic opportunity who are able to create things online and become financially sustainable. And then we have some questions. I haven't seen anybody yet look at the role of art in Condrative cycles. Condrative cycles are very long economic cycles of 200 to 400 years. We became aware of them in the early 20th century when finally we had enough data about what was happening in the economy to begin to see very long waves. Economists think in terms of waves of different lengths, and Condrative cycles are the longest waves. They talk about technological innovation relative to Condrative waves, but I think there's a really interesting research question on the role of art in Condrative waves, given the impact of art on how we cognitively process information and how we experience the world. A very contemporary problem is how we distinguish art from other types of innovation activities. Just a few highlights from early digital art history. Leonardo, we were just honored by Molina, was founded in 1967, 1968. As he mentioned, Ars Electronica is an annual festival that is more fun than you can imagine. If anybody can get to Linz, Austria once a year, was launched in 1979. I mentioned that Minneapolis was really the first Silicon Valley. Cray Computer Company was the first to build supercomputers, and it began to hire artists on staff to provoke, stimulate, be involved in conversations with the computer scientists, because Seymour Cray so believed that creativity and artistic sensibilities and aesthetics were critical to success in supercomputing. By the mid-1990s, and for those of you who know anything about internet history, it wouldn't be surprising that a lot happened in that period, because although they began designing what we now call the internet in 1969, and the word internet came into use in 1974. Many of us, if you were associated with research universities, were online by the mid-1980s. I was on email in '87. But the internet became commercialized, meaning available to anyone for any purpose in '93, '94. And of course, that opened up a whole lot of experimentation of a wide variety of times. So a lot of things happened in the mid-90s. One thing that really jumped out was when you went to something like Ars Electronica, or there were other conferences in that era looking at digital art, the artists specifically called out the programmers they were working with as artists themselves and made clear they couldn't be doing what they're doing without the programmers. And it wasn't just that those were skills hired, it was that the artists, the programmers are artists. We began to see public discussion of art in the net. We had a first international listserv on the subject. Okay, I'm the one who ran that for artists and arts organizations. Scientists began to realize that visualization of data affects how they theorize, that they're not just pretty pictures. This was, Melina mentioned Donna Cox at Illinois. I was at Illinois at the time and involved also with the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. When these realizations were dawning, it was a very exciting thing. They really thought they were just going to get magazine covers and then realized that they were understanding their data completely differently once they were able to visualize it. Of course, we know now that 50% of the human brain is given to processing images. So in retrospect, it's not surprising, but people at the time were just like astonished. There was a first Art in the Net conference held in Boston. And in the last year, we became aware for the first time that the guy who organized that, Jay Jaroslav, actually worked for the CIA at the time, and I guess now. So that was a bit of a shock. I gave the keynote, and I didn't know I had done that for a CIA organized event. Geert Lovink in Amsterdam put forward the rhizomatic theory that Melina referred to in 1995 and launched with others what became NetTime by 1998. This is a great listserv that I still follow and many still do at the intersection of art, politics, and technology. And in my experience, perhaps the longest lived listserv I've been a part of, and I don't know how it relates to those in other fields. When we think about art and cultural capital, we know that commodification of information has been stimulating efforts to quantify cultural capital. There's one could do a whole journal article on that. But the multiplication and ease of manipulation of symbols reduces the general stock of cultural capital. Cultural capital has been dissociated from its Bourdieuian field. And that decline in cultural capital that is actually resulting is an issue for civil society because of its role in community formation and sustenance. Forgive me if I'm talking too fast, but A, we're behind schedule, and B, I've been told that if you talk fast, people actually pay more attention or capture more. So, but holler if I'm going too fast. Then we have art and political capital. So we see demands for creativity. The creative class becomes a policy issue. The tactical media folks, again, Geert Lovink and colleagues in Amsterdam and now globally, think of what they're doing as pre-policy. And there's an interesting piece that could be done on the relationship between hacking and art. And often hacking is very much like art processes and production. But this notion that it's not about whether what you're doing is legal or illegal, it's about doing something so creative and new in the digital environment that then actually policymakers have to think about it. The tactical media folks are also seeing politics as an artistic medium. Politics as an artistic medium, extremely interesting. We are distinguishing among different types of information processing involved in art for differential legal treatment. That's been true in US constitutional law back since it started. I'm actually doing research right now on the Marshall Court, which was 1801 to 1835, and looking at that. But that can be fully developed for how it is affecting artists in particular. And then there are two very interesting political dangers. The first is the inference attack problem. So in the 1970s, through a couple of different means, it happened in libel law, it happened with the issue of prior restraint or censorship of publications that the US government claimed were important from a national security perspective. But they began to work on what's called the inference attack problem. By the 90s, this became something that NATO countries were actively working on together. It wasn't just an obscure or rare issue. The inference attack problem is an effort to make illegal modes of making inference based on information to which you legally have the right of access, but the conclusions of which are politically or militarily unavailable. An aggregation attack is related, that you've added up a bunch of information to which you legally have the right of access, but the government doesn't like the political or military implications of the insights that you gain that way. This has been brought into US law under the phrase, the mosaic theory. So we have a history of classifying information and making it unavailable to us. This is a project that is working on making illegal certain modes of information processing. That's important to artists. The other political danger in this digital environment is what I call the statistical improbability problem. So one of the things you might say about great art is that what great artists produce is statistically improbable. They produce something you didn't predict. What you you wouldn't have expected would be something you would have seen or heard. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990s, let's not talk, irrespective of what's happening now, that was believed it had collapsed at the beginning of the 90s. Western countries had the problem of defining what was the enemy under these new conditions. You couldn't say communism, you couldn't say the Soviet Union. So what did you say? And so they came up, it was called New Security Theory in the early 1990s. They came up with 4 categories of the enemy. And one of those was anybody who has anything to do with drugs. So Interpol was very happy. Anybody who is economically threatening the country. So now you're a successful Subaru dealer in Phoenix. You're a terrorist, and we've seen where the word terrorist and the concept of terrorism has taken such great play. But the 4th category of the enemy under new military theory was anyone whose behavior is statistically improbable. And again, that's what artists do, right? You produce things that are statistically improbable. So should there be success in criminalizing certain modes of inference, and should there be further operationalization and implementation of treating those whose behaviors are statistically improbable, these are real political dangers for artists in the digital environment. So I've argued that art is key to the tactical memory we need to communicate politically under conditions of constant total surveillance. The political war of the 21st century can be understood as between the algorithmic ability to profile, relate, and discern inference and networks, et cetera. A war between that and our creative ability to use, create, and share content in ways that constantly move ahead of the map, so that we can continue to be statistically improbable and communicate about our shared political concerns in all the ways that we would like. So just in brief summary, economically, art is becoming ever more important to the creation of capital, but politically, there's the danger of shutting the same processes down. That's fueled by changes to the nature of cultural capital. In my view, the future of artistic practice is unclear. Okay, they're producing the novel by AI. What does that leave for the James Joyces of the world? The market in finished goods will survive either way, because that's how capitalism works. They will make it work. But what that means for individual artists is less clear to me. So I think research questions those interested in this domain face right now are the differences between distributed versus community-based art. There has been for decades, led by Costa Rica and others, of recognition that traditional folk forms, music, images, that the intellectual property rights belong to the community, not to the individual artists, and they can't be seized and commodified by others just because they're community-based. But we now have the issue of distributed art production as well. That's a different matter. We have the difference between intentional and unintentional art, between conscious and unconscious art, which again looks at the machinic domain, the difference between human and machinic art and how we should think about that, and the blockchain and art, which involves NFTs but goes beyond NFTs as well, and includes actually the environmental consequences of art, since the blockchain, when it's proof of work, as it is still everywhere, causes enormous environmental damage. So that's where I am. If you want further information, I'm available by email, and I have a number of publications in this domain that are available if of interest.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, since we're behind the schedule, maybe in the audience, if you have questions, email Dr. Braman. And also, Sandra, we have a few questions on the chat, so you may answer to those questions.
Yes, just briefly. The listserv is NetTime, NETTIME. Yes, several politicians today could be characterized best as performance artists, and I found it particularly interesting that the president of this university wanted to put a new department of journalism into the School of Performing Arts. That we need to make some hay with that. Makers and makerspaces, I would broadly, yes, include, right, it's not about elite art only, anybody who's making. And I think the deal with the rollerblading artists was, I think they had some like honest agreement about how much money the guy could take.
Okay, thank you so much.